The alarm on Meridian Station did not sound like an alarm at all. It sounded like a held breath. Every light along the ceiling panels dimmed to a low amber at once, and for 3 full seconds nobody in the lower commons moved, because the station had never done that before, not in the 2 years humans had lived on it. Then the actual siren started, and Cale Voss, age 11, was already running. He was not running toward the evacuation lights. He was running the wrong way, past the crowd funneling toward Dock 7, back down the searing corridor toward the schoolrooms, because IZA was still in there, and IZA could not run. That was the shape of the whole story, if you looked at it from far enough away. A boy ran the wrong way. Everything that happened afterward, the news feeds, the council session, the doctrine that fell apart one clause at a time, came from that one small, stubborn decision made by a kid who wasn't thinking about doctrine at all. He was thinking about a girl who beat him at station ball twice a week and would never forgive him if he left without her. But that comes later. First, you have to understand how they met. Meridian Station orbited a gas giant nobody on Earth had bothered naming yet, and it existed because humanity had just barely qualified for something called provisional contact status, which was the galaxy's way of saying, you're new, you're strange, and we haven't decided if we like you yet. A few hundred human families had been sent up as a kind of long trial run, scientists, engineers, and their kids, folded into a station that already housed 6 other species, most of whom had been flying between stars since before humans figured out bronze. Cale's family had been there 4 months when he first saw IZA, and what he noticed was not her mobility rig. He noticed that she was sitting completely alone at the far end of the play deck, in the one spot where the gravity plating ran slightly uneven, and that nobody was sitting near her. The Syntheri were a tall, elegant species, silver-skinned, built for low gravity and high ceilings, and IZA's exoskeleton, the hard external shell every Syntheri child grew instead of a spine, had come in wrong. Brittle in places, fused in others. It meant she couldn't do the thing every other Syntheri kid could do without thinking, which was launch herself 20 feet across a room in one clean jump. She used a mobility rig instead, a frame that hugged her lower body and let her move at a fraction of everyone else's speed, and the other kids treated her like a supply cart parked in the wrong lane. Cale didn't know any of that yet. He just saw a kid sitting by herself, and he was new too, and new kids find each other the way water finds a crack in a wall. You're bad at station ball, he said, which was not a good opening line, but it was true. He'd watched her attempt to catch a pass twice and miss both times, the rig's turning radius too slow to compensate. IZA looked at him with an expression he would later learn meant something like, "Are you serious right now?" and said, "The game is built for people who jump. I do not jump. So we should build a different game." That was it. That was the whole beginning. No speech, no grand gesture. Just an 11-year-old boy treating an obvious problem like an obvious problem, the way you'd treat a jammed door. You don't write an essay about the door, you just find a crowbar. Over the next few weeks, a different game became several different games. Cale dragged 2 skateboards from the human recreation locker and bolted a flat platform between them, low enough that IZA could roll onto it from her rig without needing to stand. He learned, badly and slowly, the hand shapes of Syntheri sign can't, because IZA's voice modulator strained after long conversation and she preferred not to talk when she was tired. He built a version of station ball with a lower net and a rule that scoring required a pass to every player on the team before a shot, which, completely by accident, made the game better for everyone, not just her, because it stopped the fastest kids from hogging the ball. There was a day, about 3 months in, that Cale never mentioned to anyone, not even IZA, though she found out about it eventually. He'd asked one of the older Syntheri boys, a kid named Orvin who ran the low-gravity climbing club, whether IZA could join, and Orvin had laughed, not cruelly, just carelessly, the way you laugh at a question that seems obviously absurd, and said the club required full structural integrity, which was a polite way of saying no. Cale had walked away without arguing, which wasn't like him, and spent the rest of that evening in the station's fabrication bay instead, badgering a board technician into teaching him how to run the laser cutter. 2 weeks later, he handed IZA a set of handholds he'd cut and sanded himself, designed to bolt onto the underside of her rig's arm extensions, low enough and close enough together that she could pull herself along a wall the way the climbing club kids did, just slower, just differently. It wasn't climbing. It was something else, something that didn't have a name yet, and IZA spent an entire afternoon testing it against the cargo bay's spare wall, while Cale sat below her calling out which holds were too far apart and adjusting the spacing that night. He never told her about Orvin, or the club, or the word no. She figured it out much later from someone else, and by then it didn't surprise her at all. That was simply how Cale solved problems, not by arguing with the people who said no, but by making the no irrelevant. None of this made Cale a hero on the station. Most of the other kids barely noticed. A few of the Century children thought it was strange, even a little embarrassing, the way you might feel embarrassed watching someone be kind to a stray animal in public. Izie's own parents were quietly, cautiously grateful, in the careful way of people who had learned not to expect much. Because here was the thing about Century society that Cale did not understand yet, and that Izie had understood her whole life. It ran on something called the doctrine of continuance. It wasn't written down as cruelty. It was written down as efficiency. Resources were finite, the doctrine said, and a civilization that spent them evenly on every citizen regardless of contribution was a civilization that would eventually starve. So resources, medical care, education slots, evacuation priority in emergencies, were allocated by projected contribution, and a girl with a fused exoskeleton, who would need lifelong accommodation and could never serve in the fleet or the labor guilds, scored low. Nobody had ever said this to Izie directly. Nobody needed to. She had grown up watching herself get quietly deprioritized, put last in line for the good medical scanner rotation, left off the roster for the school trip that required full mobility, seated at the edge of every room. She had stopped expecting otherwise so long ago that when Cale built her a ramp for the skateboard platform, she didn't say thank you. She just stared at it for a long moment like she was checking it for a catch. There wasn't one. That was the strange part to her. There was never a catch with Cale. He built things because they were broken, and moved on to the next broken thing, and somewhere in the space of about a year, the next broken thing had quietly become my best friend. And neither of them had noticed the exact day it happened. The docking accident happened on a Tuesday, which felt wrong to Cale afterward, in the same way it always feels wrong that huge things happen on ordinary days. A cargo hauler making its final approach to Dock 7 suffered a guidance failure and clipped the outer ring, and the impact cracked 2 pressure seals along C ring, the same corridor as the schoolrooms. Nobody died in the initial impact, but the station's automated systems flagged a cascading structural risk, and Meridian Station, for the first time in its operational history, called a full evacuation. Evacuation protocol on Meridian Station was, like everything else that governed daily life, a compromise document stitched together by 7 species who agreed on almost nothing. But the underlying logic, in situations where boarding capacity was limited and time was short, defaulted to something called priority sequencing, and priority sequencing had been drafted primarily by the Century Administrative Office, because the Century had the most experience running large stations and everyone else had deferred to them on the paperwork nobody wanted to write. Priority sequencing ranked evacuees using something the manual called operational contribution weighting. It was the doctrine of continuance wearing a different uniform. Cale didn't know any of this when he reversed direction in the Searing corridor. He didn't know there was a ranking system at all. He only knew that everyone was running toward Dock 7, that Izie's rig moved at a fraction of running speed, and that in a crowd like this, a fraction of running speed meant last or not at all. The corridor lighting had switched fully to emergency amber by the time he reached the schoolroom wing, and the air carried a thin, metallic smell that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier, venting from somewhere beyond the cracked seals, close enough to worry about, not yet close enough to panic over. A station announcement repeated itself every 15 seconds in 3 languages, calm and mechanical, telling everyone that Dock 7 was accepting evacuees and that all personnel should proceed there immediately. Cale counted the interval between announcements without meaning to. 15 seconds. He'd covered maybe 200 meters in the time it took the message to repeat twice. He found her exactly where he expected, in the schoolroom, trying to navigate the rig through a doorway that had buckled slightly out of true, off by maybe 4 centimeters, which for anyone else would have been nothing, and for the rig's frame was the difference between fitting and not. Go, Izie told him, not looking up from the doorway. I'll take the freight lift. The freight lift's on the other side of the impact. I know. So you're not taking the freight lift. She looked at him then, and there was something in her face that Cale would spend a long time trying to describe afterward and never quite manage. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to resignation. like she had already run this scenario in her head years ago on some other station, in some other version of this exact moment, and already knew how it went. "You should go," she said again, gently this time, like she was doing him a favor. "This isn't your emergency to fix." Cale didn't answer that. He just got down on the floor, found the jammed lower hinge of the rig's front wheel where it had caught on the doorway's buckled seam, and started working it free with his hands, the same way he'd fixed 100 small broken things over the past year. Took him 90 seconds. Felt like 90 years. They made it out of the schoolroom together, Izier's rig moving at its slow, steady pace and Cale walking beside her instead of ahead, because he'd figured out a long time ago that walking ahead just meant turning around to wait, and waiting in front of someone feels worse than walking beside them. They reached dock 7:40 seconds after boarding had begun, and 30 seconds after a Centhary loading officer, working from a manifest generated by priority sequencing, had made a call that would end up in front of a Galactic Council 11 weeks later. Izier's name was flagged Tier 4. Low projected contribution, high accommodation cost, non-essential personnel dependent. Tier 4 boarded last if capacity allowed. Capacity, according to the manifest scrolling on the loading officer's slate, did not allow. "She's not boarding," the officer said, not unkindly, almost apologetically, the way you'd explain a rule to a child, which was exactly what Cale was. "There will be a second wave. Her family has been notified. You should board now with your own group." Cale looked at the shuttle. He looked at the officer. He looked at Izier, who had gone very still in the way people go still when they're trying very hard not to make a scene about something they've been trained their whole life to accept quietly. Then Cale sat down on the floor of the loading bay, directly in front of the boarding ramp, and said, "No." What happened over the next 6 minutes became, later, the single most replayed piece of footage in the history of human galactic contact, and it happened for reasons that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the fact that Cale Voss was 11 years old and did not yet understand that some rules were supposed to be too big to argue with. He didn't make a speech. He didn't cite regulations because he didn't know any. He said, "She's my friend, and friends don't get a second wave." And when the loading officer tried to explain, again patiently, that this was a capacity issue and not a judgment of her worth, Cale said the thing that ended up quoted on every human newsfeed within 9 hours. "Then find capacity. That's your job. Leaving her isn't a math problem, it's a decision, and you're the one making it." 2 other kids sat down next to him. A human girl named Priya who'd known Izier from the low-gravity art class, and, more surprisingly, a young Centhary boy named Dresh who had never spoken to Izier in his life but who had, evidently, been raised by parents who quietly hated the doctrine and had never found the nerve to say so out loud. 3 kids blocking a boarding ramp is not an army. It is barely an obstacle. But it was enough to stop the loading process cold, because nobody, not the officer, not the station's automated systems, not the increasingly nervous adults gathering behind them, had a protocol for 3 children refusing to move. Cale's mother reached the dock 90 seconds later, took one look at the situation, and instead of pulling her son off the floor, she sat down next to him. That was the image that ended up circling the galactic net. Not the accident. Not even Cale's original sit-in. It was a grown human woman, an engineer with station clearance and every reason to simply override the situation through official channels, choosing instead to sit on the floor next to her child, because, as she said afterward, in an interview she never expected to give, "If my son thinks this is worth stopping the line for, I'm not going to be the adult who tells him it isn't." The second wave, it turned out, existed the entire time. The officer had been telling the truth about that much. There genuinely was a second shuttle, genuinely capable of carrying Tier 4 evacuees. What nobody had said out loud, because nobody needed to under the doctrine, was that second wave meant after the people who matter, and that in a structural failure scenario, second wave sometimes meant not at all. It didn't come to that. The structural risk was contained within the hour, the evacuation stood down, and everyone, Tier 1 through Tier 4, went home to quarters that were, for the most part, undamaged. Nobody died. Nothing collapsed. But the footage existed. And the footage did not care that the crisis had passed safely. What happened next surprised almost everyone involved, including Cale, who spent the following week fairly certain he was in trouble. The station's internal security recordings were not meant to be public. But Meridian Station ran on 7 different administrative systems that did not always talk to each other cleanly, and a junior human communications tech reviewing footage for an unrelated safety report, watched 6 minutes of it twice, forwarded it to a friend because you have to see this, and by the following morning it had reached Earth's diplomatic mission with a note attached that essentially said, "You need to see how this looks from the outside." From the outside, it looked very simple. It looked like a species that had been part of galactic society for less than 2 years, still considered primitive by nearly everyone with a seat on the council, watching an 11-year-old boy calmly refuse to accept that a friend could be sorted into a lower tier of personhood because fixing her body cost more than fixing someone else's. Earth's ambassador, a woman named Odalise Farrow who had spent 18 exhausting months being condescended to in council sessions by species with 10,000 years of spaceflight behind them, watched the footage 3 times and then did something almost nobody expected. She requested it be entered formally into the record of an upcoming council review on Syntheri administrative policy, which had been scheduled months earlier for entirely unrelated reasons and which nobody had expected to be interesting. It became interesting very fast. Delegates who had spent decades perfecting the art of looking politely uninterested during council proceedings found themselves leaning forward. A few species without any real stake in Syntheri internal policy requested copies of the footage for their own archives afterward, not for diplomatic reasons, but because their aides had watched it on a private feed and quietly passed it around. One delegate, from a species whose entire culture was organized around collective memory rather than individual achievement, was overheard telling an aide that the boy on the recording reminded her of something her own people had stopped doing generations ago and never quite found a way to explain why they missed it. The council session that followed was not, contrary to what a lot of the human press coverage implied, a dramatic courtroom battle where Earth stood up and lectured the galaxy about morality. Most of it was procedural and dull, full of species arguing about resource allocation formulas in language so dry it could strip paint. But 11 minutes of it were not dull, because 11 minutes of it were the footage itself, shown at the Syntheri delegation's own request, because, as their senior representative admitted afterward, in one of the more remarkable moments of the entire proceeding, we would rather show it ourselves than have it shown to us. Ambassador Farrow did not argue that the doctrine of continuance was evil. She was smarter than that, and she'd been coached well by people who understood that nothing turns a room against you faster than moral superiority delivered by the newest, least experienced species in it. Instead, she asked a single question on the record to the Syntheri delegation. Your doctrine assumes that a citizen's value can be measured by projected future contribution. I'd like to understand, who decided that friendship doesn't count as a contribution? Because on my planet, we've found it's one of the only things that actually holds a civilization together. And a boy on your own station just demonstrated that better than any policy paper I could submit. There was no dramatic reversal in the room. Nobody applauded. Doctrines that took generations to build do not fall apart in a single afternoon. But something shifted that afternoon regardless, the kind of shift that doesn't show up as a headline but shows up 18 months later as a quietly revised clause, then a pilot program, then a slow erosion of a rule nobody had ever quite had the nerve to question from the inside. The Syntheri government did not abolish priority sequencing that year or the year after, but they suspended it for evacuation scenarios within 6 months, pending review, the single fastest policy reversal in the doctrine's 400-year history, and the review, still ongoing 3 years later, had already produced one unambiguous outcome. No Syntheri child would again be ranked by an algorithm during an emergency evacuation. Whatever else the council eventually decided, that much held. None of this meant very much to Iza on the day it happened. She learned about the council session the way most kids learn about the adult world's slow machinery, secondhand in fragments mostly ignored in favor of more immediate concerns, which for her was the fact that her old mobility rig had finally, after the doorway incident and the stress of the evacuation, cracked clean through at the left hip joint and needed replacing. The new one arrived 2 months later, shipped from Earth, built by a small engineering firm owned by Kale's aunt, who had heard the whole story from her sister and decided, in the specific and slightly overwhelming way some adults have of turning feelings into action, that she was not going to let a kid who'd made galactic news get sent a replacement part built to minimum spec. The new rig was, by any reasonable measure, absurd. It was rated for terrain the station didn't have. It had a top speed that made the old rig look like it had been standing still. Iza's parents, opening the shipping crate, laughed for the first time in what Iza realized was a very long while, because taped to the inside of the crate was a handwritten note in Kale's terrible handwriting that said, "Normal replacement parts weren't good enough. Built you a better one. Race you Friday. She beat him. That was the part that mattered most to her, more than the council session, more than the footage, more than any of it. Friday came, the new rig performed exactly as advertised, and for the first time in either of their lives, IZA crossed the finish line of the searing corridor a full 4 seconds ahead of Kael'vas, who staggered in behind her, out of breath, grinning so hard it looked like it hurt. "That's not fair," he said. "That rig's basically a rocket." "You built the rocket," IZA said. "That's your fault." A small crowd had gathered to watch, the way small crowds do on a station where nothing much happens most days, and among them stood 2 members of the station's alien administrative staff, watching the scene with an expression that neither of them could quite name. It was not the expression of people watching a diplomatic incident. It was not the expression of people watching a historic reconciliation, either. It was simpler than that and stranger, and it took the older of the 2 staff members almost a full minute to identify it correctly. It was the expression of people watching 2 kids race down a hallway, one of them laughing, the other one winning, and neither of them thinking, even for a second, about doctrines or councils or tears. They logged the footage anyway. Some habits, even galactic ones, take longer to unlearn than others. But underneath the log entry, the older staff member typed one additional line, off the record, that nobody ever officially filed and nobody ever asked her to remove. Some things are simply not supposed to require an explanation. This was one of them. The end.